Well, thank you to all of you who have just joined, and I do hope the audio and the video is working for all of you. For those of you who are calling in, I am using a PowerPoint presentation to talk. So if you would, and we'll try to make sure that you have access to this presentation in one of our communications back to you. So it's a pleasure to be back in touch with you all. Many of you I may have met in person, but probably no doubt there are some of you that I have not met in person in the past year. As you all know, this is a culmination of some intense work on our side, and I'm very pleased that either I have already visited some of you, or I will be very shortly visiting some of you. I've got a full schedule of travel lined up from here on out into April. I'll be out of the office every week. But before I get started on the presentation, I'd like to take a minute to introduce the team. You will see them in the little thumbnail. So over to you, folks.
So, hi, good morning. My name is Marilyn Benjamin, and I'm the Senior Grants Manager.
Hi, Chris Crothers. I'm the Director of Impact Investing.
And I'm Katie Ensign, and I'm Vice President for Placemaking and Administration. And we have a couple of our team members who are not present today, but are critical players on the team, and that is Mark Walker, is the Director of the Jesse and Senior Program Officer, and Barbara Rule is the Director of Equity.
And my name is Banks Willis, and I am the moderator.
Perfect. Now, just as an administrative note, some of you may have heard that we will be open to Q&A. And if you are on the Zoom app, there is a Q&A box at the bottom or at the top of your screen. Click on that, type in your question, and Banks will be able to take your questions and read them out to me as we finish up the presentation. Now, just a note that questions that are specific to your organization and perhaps any proposals that you're thinking about should be directed to your program officer. It would probably not be appropriate to talk about your specific case in front of everybody else. But back to the presentation here. As you can see, we've titled this session The Power of Belonging. I'm going to explain the what and the why of belonging, but first, a sense of how we got to the power of belonging. Just going to describe a little bit the process that we engaged in over the last year. One is we engaged in research, and that research started with, first and foremost, a history of our grant making, both to individual organizations, but also sliced via geography. Where did we give? What types of institutions did we give to? And what did we give for? So there was a lot of digging into that data. We also did research on the context that each community faces. And by this, I mean physical communities like Port St. Joe or the Middle Peninsula in Virginia. But, what is being faced, what is the context faced by, say, liberal arts colleges, which are all over the nation, but you all share the same context in some ways. And through this, we found a number of things. For instance, we found out that gun violence in Wilmington is one of the highest in the nation. You don't necessarily hear about Wilmington a lot, but on a per capita basis, gun violence in Wilmington is higher than gun violence in Chicago, which we do hear a lot about. Another fact we found out is that HIV infection rates in Jacksonville are quite high. Relative to other cities in the nation. Housing affordability is something of concern to almost every community. And then going back to the campus context, we discovered issues like food insecurity on campus, as well as housing insecurity on campus. Second, we also sought to get grantee input, which fed into the visioning and focus process that we engaged in. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the grantee input, but obviously the visioning and focus work that we did was done not just with the team here, but with the trustees as well as key stakeholders. Turning to grantee input, this is one of the results from the Committee for Effective Philanthropy's grantee survey. It is the largest, the CEP is the organization that carries out the largest number of grantee surveys for foundations. And what's valuable about getting this work done by CEP is that we can benchmark ourselves. And you'll see in the next slide how we benchmarked ourselves. It went out to 145 of you, some of you may be on this call, who had active grants with us in the last 2 years. And 106 of the 145 of you gave us feedback, which is an extremely high number. So thank you. And finally, turning to the actual slide, this is a word cloud generated from the qualitative comments that you all made in your commentary about us. And as you can see, you're extremely complimentary to us, which is not surprising given that we're funder. I get that. But we're helpful, generous, supportive, responsive, and thoughtful. And when it comes to how we do relative to other organizations, here you can see in the next slide, we are quite high in terms of the strengths of relationships with grantees. And that specifically is that last line on this slide, where we're 62nd in the overall cohort of foundations interviewed by CEP. And we're very close to the custom cohort, which is that line you see at the bottom underneath that bar graph. So that's a strength of ours. But if you look at some of the other bar graphs on this slide, you will see that we actually are quite low on field impact, and we're quite low on community impact. And this, as far as I'm concerned, is an opportunity because we have quite strong relationships with you. There's evidence out there that foundations that have strong relationships with their grantees actually have a chance to achieve higher impact. But this really gave us food for thought. I mean, this feedback came back and we're like, okay, so what does this tell us? And you'll see how it fed into our visioning and focus process. Even on organizational impact, which, 60th percentile, that's not so bad. But compared to our custom cohort, again, the line underneath the top graph, we are actually a little lower than the benchmark. So one thing that became clear to us as we were engaging in our visioning process is that our big, hairy, audacious goal is to ensure that we change these metrics around community and field impact. If we can change these metrics, we will have a chance to move the needle on certain issues in the communities Jesse loved. And if we achieve these goals, we will have the power to influence other flows of money to support a sense of belonging. Now back to that question of belonging. Really, we were extremely influenced by the legacy and instructions, really, that Mrs. duPont gave us. You will see in this picture of Mrs. duPont with her family. Mrs. duPont is circled in red. You can really pick up how she was different. You can see, she's sort of almost glowering at the photographer. You can pick up her intelligence, her energy, and her determination. And you can see the drive that made her Alfred I. duPont's partner in business, but perhaps also an understanding of what it meant to have been kept back. She was a woman in an era where women didn't have professional identities and accomplishments. She became a professional. She became a principal of a high school. And, before she got married to Alfred I. duPont, she basically supported the rest of her family on her earnings as a principal. There's a story of her being the one who decided that her dad's bills needed to get collected on, and she would head out on horseback in the Northern Neck to collect on her bills. So she was an extraordinary woman of her time. But back to place and back to roots. I drove to Kilmarnock in the Northern Neck from Washington, D.C. last year, and I saw this large sign for Epping Forest Antiques. Now, for those of you from Jacksonville, you will know why I was struck by the sign for Epping Forest Antiques, because here in Jacksonville, there's a part of Jacksonville that's known as Epping Forest. It is the area around her home, which has now turned into a housing development and a club. But everyone in Jacksonville knows where Epping Forest is. And the reason Epping Forest exists in Jacksonville is because Mrs. DuPont memorialized Epping Forest at her home. And so you can tell how much place mattered to her. And I think that really her accomplishments as a professional, as a philanthropist, really in many dimensions of her life, I think it came from her sense of belonging. She really had a sense of where she came from. She came from the Northern Neck. She came from the Ball family. She, one of the daughters of the American Revolution. And I think that gave her extraordinary amounts of confidence. And she turned that into the accomplishments of her life, but also the generosity with which she left us the fund. So as we sat there thinking about her legacy and what we wanted to do here at the fund, we began to ask ourselves, how can we create that sense of belonging in every community that she cared about, so that as many people, especially people who have been systematically excluded from that sense of belonging, can go out in the world with the confidence that Jessie had. So that really led us to a crystallization of our mission and vision, which is that our mission is to serve the communities and institutions Jessie knew and loved. And it's really about places, whether they're communities or institutions, because those places actually make or break the lives that people have in those communities. After all, we live, work, learn, and play in place. And so if we can make a difference to the places and spaces occupied these communities and institutions, we think that we can move the needle in terms of the lives of the people who live in those places. And I think it is no accident that zip code is one of the primary determinants of whether you do well. It doesn't matter what your race is, but if you're born into what's considered a higher income zip code, even if your own household doesn't actually have that higher income, you have a much better chance of succeeding in life. And so we really want to try and see if we can move the needle on all of these zip codes that Mrs. DuPont cared about. And you really already do the work that we are envisioning doing. But if our mission is to serve the communities Jessie knew and loved, our vision is a world in which every member of those communities feels that they belong fully. Because we know that there are people in communities and institutions that perhaps don't feel that they fully belong, whether it is first generation students at universities, or whether it is people who have been systematically excluded from building assets in the physical communities that we work in. So we really want to embrace the concept of including everybody and making sure that everyone feels like they belong. This is not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do, because we know that the more diverse the community is, and that the more included those diverse people feel, we know that that generates more creativity. We know that that actually generates greater economic growth, and it is one of the engines of prosperity. Now, it's also, the thing we have to do as a tax-exempt entity. We enjoy the privilege of not paying taxes, and we take that responsibility and privilege seriously. That means that we have to ensure that our grant making as well as our investments, actually benefit the largest number of people possible, and that we do not exclude anyone from that work. So, put very succinctly, this is our theory of change. We believe that with belonging comes power, and that power comes with trust and social capital that is built between the individuals in that community, and that gives the community the power to tackle the challenges that they face. So what does that mean in practice? Well, we want to support programs that reduce structural and systemic barriers that have prevented anyone from feeling that they belong and from reaching their full potential. So some examples of that, of things that we have already supported: we are free tax preparation and financial counseling for low-income working families. That work's been carried out by the United Way of Northeast Florida. It's been carried out by the United Way of Delaware. We've supported programs and services for first-generation college students at Florida Southern College, Washington and Lee, Wingate University, Washington College. And we actually know that probably every single college and university that we work with already does that work. We may not have specifically supported it, but we're now open to supporting it in all of those organizations. And what is different now is that for all these higher ed colleges and universities in the portfolio, we are not just supporting the removal of academic barriers, but we are prepared now to address other types of barriers that prevent students from persisting through to graduation. Another area of focus for us will be investing in the public spaces that welcome all. And we want to enhance and support community efforts that address the quality of life and opportunity for residents and increase creative activity and create a distinct sense of space. We've done that through our support of LISC Jacksonville. We've done that in parks in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And many of you have done this without our help. An example is the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. This is an equestrian statue that just went up on Arthur Ashe Boulevard in Richmond, Virginia. And it is an arresting statue. It's huge. It's an equestrian statue in the style of military statuary. But you'll notice that the rider is not a general. It is a young African-American man wearing a hoodie, torn jeans, and Timberland boots. And it's called Rumors of War. And many of you, I'm sure, have heard of the debate going on in Richmond about Confederate statues, whether they should stay, whether they should go down. What the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts did was to engage in that dialogue artistically. So now, in addition to the Confederate statues, there's this statue of a young African-American man. And so in some ways, they're in an artistic dialogue with each other. But think of what this does to a young African-American boy coming to visit the museum. As he walks into the museum, he will see this representation of someone that he could grow up to be. So this is a very powerful statement for inclusion. You belong at this museum as much as anybody else. We didn't support the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts to do this work, but it's an incredible example. This next example that I'm going to talk about, we did support. This is a group of kids in Port St. Joe, which is a tiny town of 3,000 people, about 3 square miles. So the organizations that work in Port St. Joe are quite small. Yet they got together in a collaborative effort, a nonprofit called Career Source, a great number of the churches there, the city and the health department, all pulled their resources to put 200 kids a year in this program. And these are kids who live in Port St. Joe, which is based on the bay, but before they join this program, may not ever have been out on the bay. So again, this is really enhancing these children's experience of the place they live in and go to school in and play in. Finally, this is an example of enhancing place and spaces that's very close to home. for those of you who actually are tenants of this building, this is you'll recognize, but for those of you who aren't and haven't visited us here in Jacksonville, this is a Jesse Ball duPont Center. It's the old public library that my predecessor, Sherry McGill, bought and refurbished to incredible, beautiful standard. And you will see in the picture on the left-hand side that it's beautiful, pristine, but empty. And it's not that there isn't anyone here. There are a bunch of tenants here. But it's not the open public space that could be used by the public isn't being used. And that's because we ourselves weren't really thinking about how to activate that space. You heard in our introduction that Mark Walker is in charge of the center, and he went around, started talking to people. How can we enhance the use of this space, not just for ourselves, but for the public at large? On the right-hand side, you'll see the outcome of one of those ideas, which is that he brought a band to the center on Art Walk, which is a monthly, Jacksonville shuts down a couple of blocks in downtown, ensures that there's stuff to do for people, food trucks, bars, art. This is our contribution to Art Walk, but you can see our building come alive in that picture. So we too are recommitting to walking our own talk. So what this amounts to is that we can have a clearer focus. And that focus is so important because I think the reason we have not had as much impact in the field or in community is because we have not had that clear focus. We've actually been doing the work, but we've not been focused on it as such. And as a result, we haven't been the greatest thought partners to those of you engaging in work around equity or placemaking. So we think by focusing on these two areas, we'll have a shot at moving the needle on community and field impact. But we're also going to make sure that we leverage the great relationship that we have with our grantees and to lean into that and to ensure that we are listening to you and what can be done in these areas. Now, I'm going to quickly go through the team, some of whom are on this call, some of whom are not. Marilyn Benjamin is going to be our senior grants manager, which is to say she is going to grant manage all of our grants. She's covering the whole portfolio. Some of you are probably familiar with Marilyn because you already work with her. For those of you who don't work with her, you will be working with her soon. Next is Chris Crothers, also here on this call, Director of Impact Investing. He will continue to have portfolio responsibility for grantees in Wilmington, as well as Christiana Care Hospital and University of Delaware. But I have asked Chris to take charge of impact investing because we really believe that as a mid-sized foundation, we have grant resources, but the power of our portfolio needs to be brought to the table. We are looking forward to making investments in some of our core communities and in the areas we care about. And Chris will be the one helping us do that. So you all, those of you outside Wilmington, may start seeing Chris because he will be traveling to the Northern Neck, to Port St. Joe, to Richmond, just to see what the opportunities there are for impact investing. Katie Ensign, who is also on this call, is a Vice President of Placemaking and Administration. She continues to have responsibility for Jacksonville, Port St. Joe, and the universities of Florida, Florida State, and Auburn. But she is also going to have a lateral responsibility for all grants that focus on place. Ditto for Barbara Rule, who is the Director of Equity. She will have lateral responsibility for all our grant making that focuses on inclusion and equity. And then she also has responsibility for pretty much all the grants that fall outside of Port St. Joe, Jacksonville, and the Northern Neck and Wilmington, which actually spans a bunch of states, not just Florida, Virginia, and Delaware, but other states, including Wisconsin, North Carolina, Massachusetts, you name it. Barbara's probably got that grantee in her portfolio. And finally, but not least, Mark Walker is the director of the Jesse, which is the Jesse Ball DuPont Center, as well as the Northern Neck and Middle Peninsula. Sorry, just skipped that. What else has changed? As many of you have experienced already, we have shifted to rolling grant deadlines. We are not waiting until the trustee meetings. The trustees actually have monthly calls, so we can address and approve grants on a rolling basis, basically month to month. We also want to have more accountability for outcomes, not just outputs, which means you all will be expected to start paying attention to outcomes as much as outputs. We are also reviewing our reporting requirements, trying to do away with things that we were asking for that perhaps aren't as important today. We are continuing our small grants program. The small grants program will be focused, just as the larger grants are, on place and on equity. And we are also reviewing other types of reporting, including endowment reporting. And finally, before I open it up to question and answer, I'm going to cover our values because I'm one of these people that believes that culture and values eat strategy for breakfast. And if we don't incorporate our strategy in our values, then we will be sunk. And so you will see that our first value is with belonging comes power. You may ask, why is that, which I explained to you, is our strategy in our values? Well, because I do believe that we have to really walk the talk. And let me give you a specific example. I said we want to focus on inclusion. Some of you may know that I come from a fairly tech-heavy background, and therefore when I came to the fund, I wanted to get everyone to start using a whole bunch of new tech. One of them included an app that allowed us to file our expense reports. And that meant not just staff, but trustees would be asked to file expense reports via this app. And I thought it was much simpler. You just take a photo of your receipt. You don't have to tape them onto sheets of paper and Xerox them. But I had not taken into account that for one of our trustees who actually has a faint tremor in his hand, it was actually challenging to ensure that he could type in the password. So that I wasn't thinking about how something like an app could or could not make a key member of our fund feel like he belonged. So these, by putting this in our values, it reminds me, as well as anybody else, that we really have to ensure that everything we do supports inclusion. Listen, act, learn, repeat is basically a value that says we are constantly learning, and that everything, including failures, but maybe especially failures, are an opportunity to learn. And we don't expect to succeed every time, because we can always go back, listen, act, and learn again. Third value is about doing better, and doing better always, which is to say that we expect excellence of ourselves, and we will encourage and support excellence in all of our grantees and our partners. And we expect it of ourselves, and we want to find ways of supporting that in everything we do. The final value, which is probably appropriate for as an ending to this webinar, is about being in it together. And it is about the fact that we cannot achieve our own goals without intense collaboration, not just with grantees, but with the community and with other funders and with other partners with whom we may not have a financial relationship, but with whom we should try to find common goals. So we are in it together. By the way, just one note, In your survey, the CEP survey, you let us know that you wanted us to keep checking in on you while the work is going on, to have more conversations and more informal touch points, more different ways of checking in with you, such as surveys. So we intend to do that. And one of the things we want to do in terms of living out these values is that we heard you, and I will try to find a way to share the CEP report with you all. I need to check in with our trustees to make sure that they are comfortable with it, but you gave us this feedback. We have gotten huge value out of it, and I think you are entitled to see what that feedback was like. So stay tuned. We hope to share the full CEP report with you soon. And now I'm going to turn to questions. Team, do you want to let me know if there's questions?
Absolutely. So, Maury, we actually got two questions based on your letter. So I'm going to read those first, and then we'll go to the Q&A. So the first one, can you give some examples of what kind of work the fund will support under the new focus areas?
Okay. So I think I talked a little bit about the kinds of work that we have already supported that falls into inclusion, the earned income tax credit work that United Way has been doing, but also the work that the organizations in Port St. Joe are doing by taking care of the kids that may not have ever been out on the bay, and their experience of Port St. Joe is radically changed simply by ensuring that in their summer programs they have a chance to learn how to kayak on the bay. Their sense of belonging on the water is radically changed, and their sense of place, Port St. Joe, where they live and learn, is radically changed. So that's work we have already done. I think, Katie, if you want to talk about the work that a grantee is talking to you about, opening up the space that they are using as a church, that might be another good example.
Sure. There is a church who has a lot of space, as many churches have, that is underutilized and only utilized really at certain times of the week and by certain groups of people, like the choir perhaps, or that sort of thing. And so they are really assessing all of the space that they have and how they can activate that space for the use of the community so that it becomes more of a community center, not just a place of worship. That certainly is its primary function, but that it really becomes a space for community. And so they have held already, yoga classes, and they have mindfulness classes and all sorts of things, but they really want to get out to the community and make that a community resource.
Perfect. Banks, do you want to tell me the next question?
Yeah. Perfect. And I think you pretty much answered this, but just so we get it out there, what is the definition of place? Will that be up to the fund or the grantee?
Really, I think it's a dialogue. It is it is as much place as in the example that Katie gave you, the church, right? The physical space of the church is a place. It can be a community, right? So when Career Source and the city of Port St. Joe got together to do the summer program, they took a group of kids that had, are typically not in a position to experience the water, which is part of Port St. Joe. That's place as much as anything else. In the context of a university, it probably includes, the university campus, but it might go beyond the university campus. How do the students and faculty and staff of a university experience that place? How do the residents of the town or city surrounding that university experience the place? So I think a lot of definitions of place are possible. I think that's something that we would like to encourage you to talk to your program officers about.
Perfect. Okay, we've actually got a lot of questions here. So from Brenda McBride, will you support projects implemented by organizations outside of your priority communities if those projects will have a broad-scale national impact?
So will we support broad-scale efforts in those communities?
That's a good question. So I'm going to read it again. Will you support projects implemented by organizations outside of your priority communities if those projects will have a broad-scale national impact?
Okay, so it's not really about the size of the support, right? It's about will we support them. I think that absolutely we will be interested in finding out what those what the broad-scale national impact might be that you are thinking of, and to the extent that we talk about place, yes, we want to see the needle move in the communities Mrs. duPont cared about, right? That's our obligation to Mrs. duPont. But if there are organizations she cared about and it has an impact on place and sense of belonging and inclusion, absolutely, we want to talk to you.
Perfect. So the next one is from Kimberly Jones. Hi there, really enjoyed this overview and appreciate your thoughtfulness. Are you working with the cities and municipalities in each region to encourage them to emphasize and prioritize placemaking and planning? I ask as a Jacksonville resident. Thank you.
As a Jacksonville question, absolutely, we are talking to cities about the importance of public spaces being as inclusive as possible, making sure that there are public. I mean, Jacksonville has a lot of parks, and so those are all public, but they're not used. Many of them are not used. There are some that are highly intensely used, many others that are not used at all. So we want to find ways of making sure that public spaces, whether they are parks or whether they are the Jesse here, the center, we want to make sure that that is a priority. And we are working with the city to support things that they are doing that fall into that category.
Great. So the next question, Ben Brokmarkle. We have multiple programs that fit very well with this new focus on equity and placemaking. Can we apply for support for more than one project or program?
Well, my generic answer is that obviously we have a limited amount of funds, and we need to ensure that we are distributing them equitably across the communities and institutions that Mrs. duPont cared about. But at the same time, we want to support really great things. Maybe, Katie, I don't know what our practice was in terms of supporting more than one or things like that. Would you mind chiming in?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right that we try to be fair and equitable across the portfolio as much as we can with limited resources. There are no hard policies against, coming in. I just would say that the practice has been to sort of wait for one grant to close and see how that goes before the trustees, they sort of like to see things come to fruition before they are ready to entertain another proposal. So not a policy, but just a practice.
Great. Thank you, Katie.
Okay, the next question is from an anonymous attendee. Are you accepting meeting requests from grantees during your travel over the next few months?
So, we are designing my travel to these places to have a lot of group meetings, and I think we will incline towards kind of having group meetings rather than meeting with every single grantee. Because I simply don't have that much time. But honestly, I think this is a discretionary question and really up to the project officer, your program officer's discretion. If he or she thinks that it is important to do that, then it's sort of up to them, not really up to me.
Perfect. So the next question is Valerie Rossplock. Are there grant funding minimums and maximums per the fund's initiatives, i.e. small grants, and other funding programs?
So there is a funding maximum on the small grants, which is $15,000, which is not to say that it has to be $15,000. In fact, if they were smaller, then they would allow us to support more of you. And small grants really are designed to either support something very discrete and small, or to engage in perhaps a exploratory process that allows you to figure out whether something you think has legs really does have legs. So it should be in the context of sorting something out that you're not quite sure of, or it should be something small. I don't think there is a formal maximum or minimum on the larger grants. Although I guess if it's over 15, the minimum on the large grants is obviously 15,000, because the small grants will accommodate anything below that. So a minimum on the large grants, a maximum on the small grants.
Perfect. So the next question is Judith Gregory, and this one I think is probably going to be kind of specific, but I'm going to read it out loud here. I have a couple of ideas listening to you as we open up Camp Arrowhead to include all new groups working with Urban Promise and the charter schools in Wilmington. This is possible as we build a new 12-month dining hall facility. I think of a church who is restructuring their space downtown to be a community center. Would these be examples of what you were talking about? And this probably is a question you would want to get with your program officer about specifically, Mari. I don't know if you have any feedback.
I don't, unless Chris has feedback. I'm assuming, Chris, it's your portfolio?
It is, yeah. No, so I think this is a great example of having us get a better understanding of what you're proposing, Judith or Judy. I know we've been working together and having conversations about the dining hall. Again, I think this is a great opportunity example of how we're going to try and walk the talk by bringing in Katie and Barbara into the conversation when we start putting these kind of overlays of equity and placemaking into it, to get a much bigger, broader idea about what you hope to accomplish at the end of the day. So be glad to have this conversation offline with you, and we can bring other program officers into the table to help think through as needed.
Perfect. So the next question is an anonymous attendee. Can you share some examples of projects you have supported for organizations who support people with invisible disabilities?
I'm probably not a good person to ask about the history of our grant making. I don't know if the folks over in the other room have examples.
We're thinking.
I mean, we have, supported grantees in the past that in the areas of certainly in mental health, and physical disabilities certainly. So we certainly have examples of that where we have helped create mental health first aid, for example. Here in Jacksonville, we have supported an organization for many years, Mental Health America, that is a terrific resource for people in Jacksonville. We've supported them both from a capacity standpoint and a programmatic standpoint. So just some things that come to mind there.
And then, in Wilmington, there's the Opportunity Center. We've worked with them for several years as they assist folks with intellectual disabilities become engaged in workforce through workforce training and placement.
Just my comment is, I hear you on the invisible disabilities, the tremor that I hadn't noticed until the problem with the app came about. In some ways, is an invisible disability. So.
There's one other, I think, really strong example in the past. We'd worked with the American Nurses Association to work on a PTSD app that really helps civilian nurses better understand, the issues that our returning veterans have had if they're not being served by the VA or they're not being served on military bases, to be able to overcome the stigma of PTSD and provide, specific assistance in helping them kind of on their journey for betterment. So this is something else I think that we've done in the past that was just highly successful, very interesting.
Yeah, and it's a great question, because we think we're including people when those disabilities are invisible until we're not.
Yep. Okay, perfect. So the next question is from Michelle Kendi. I'm sure that not everyone has the same opportunities for collaboration as we do in Jacksonville, but is there a way for us to learn from the experiences and program results you have mentioned today that we don't know about from each other? And how can we find them and learn about successful happenings?
That's a great question. And I don't think we have done as much as we can in the space of sharing all the knowledge and experience that resides in each one of you. So we will definitely be thinking about that in the space of higher ed, as well as possibly museums/historical societies. I know that Barbara is thinking about creating regional or other types of convenings so that we might sort of learn from each other and find different ways of letting each of you know what others have done. So that is a physical convening, but not everyone will be able to attend a physical convening. And, if you're outside of higher ed or museums, this might not be particularly relevant. I know that I have asked Katie to start thinking about us sending out information and news and tidbits around placemaking. So look in your inboxes, stay tuned for that. And I think we will be thinking about different ways in which we can ensure that this type of sharing happens. We don't want to inundate your inboxes, but if you have ideas about ways in which this can be done in a way that works with the cadence of your work and work day, let us know and we'll take that into account.
Perfect. And Michelle just had a second comment, which we will connect her with Chris. But like that app, I would love to learn more from other grantees. Okay, so another question from Ben Brookmarkle. Is the process for making grant applications with this new focus up and running now? And I know we can answer that question. It'll be probably the first 2 weeks of March when that happens.
Marilyn and Dennis, I think you're in a better position to say if that's the right answer.
So it's probably going to be in the first 2 weeks of March.
Which is not to say that you shouldn't be engaging in the dialogue that you have always had with the program officers. So don't wait until the first 2 weeks of March to have the dialogue. Have the dialogue now so that by the time the grant application flow is up and running, you can enter the information.
Great. So that's all we have for now. I'm kind of refreshing here to see if any others come in. No. I think that's it. Yep, that's it.
All right. Thank you for a lively Q&A, and I very much look forward to meeting some of you in person in my travels.